I mean, I too, picking up on Barry's comments, I want to welcome this report. I really think it is fantastic that this report has been written from this organisation with this constituency. Do you want me to start all over again? No. Barry, I was saying nice things about you. The microphone wasn't working. And basically I wanted to say this is really very good, that this constituency, and I salute you for doing this, because frankly, as Barry's elegant data, for years, he's an old friend of mine too, for years they have been churning out this stunning demographic and epidemiological data documenting the problem. It's almost like seeing in slow motion bodies, except it's populations, walking over a cliff, and us just watching it and counting them as they're going over and saying, well, isn't this terrible? And we don't really know what to do about it. And Barry's very elegant response to Kevin's question, is there anywhere which can give us hope? Essentially, he was saying in Barry speak, no, not yet, but who knows, and it's too early to say. So I've got 7 things I wanted to say to add to this debate, because I think there is both a strange situation developing, both evidence mounting and also frustration mounting, to pick up Kevin's sort of nice words about me, both looking at the data and also saying we've got to do something about it. My first point is that it's even more complex than Barry was saying. This is the big change in food and public health of the 20th century. And the code word obesity is actually one word, or obesity and overweight, if you want to use 3 words, and that nutrition transition, to use Barry's famous 2 words, is actually a shorthand for changing everything. Changing how we live, the nature of the food supply, the nature of the food production system, the lengthening of the food production system, the transformation of what it does, how things are grown, and power shifting within that food supply chain. It is astonishing what has gone on in the last 70 years. It is astonishing. And actually around obesity and overweight, we are being asked by the data, the population bodies falling over the cliff, these trends, we're actually having to rethink the definition of progress of the 20th century with regard to food. Point number 1. There are therefore no simple solutions. This is, if the problems are complex in their etiology, there is nothing simple that's going to resolve it. There's no quick fix, no instant lever, no genetic tweaking, or no product, or no little control on marketing, nothing. It's actually got to be a multiple set of things. And that I want to explore. And yet, I think the dynamics are beginning to be understood. I'm an old friend of Barry Popkin. I've known him decades. I've watched the building up of this data, of him and many other people. It's staggering how firm the data is. It's not that we can say the world isn't getting fat. Barry's book, The World is Fat. You see it. It's not that it's something we have to say, prove it to me. It's there. It's before our eyes. It's us. Just look at photos of people in Britain in the 1930s on beaches. They're thin. Now look at photos of peaches on beaches today. There are some thin people, but not many. You know, in modern terms, I'm seen as thin. I'm actually fat historically. You know, the norms have changed. Point number 1. We understand some of these dynamics and some of the data. Point number 2. I think, and my colleagues and I at our centre at City University for 20 years have argued that this, what we call productionist model, It's not just making agriculture more efficient. It's an entire system, supply system. It's an entire food system. And Mike Heisman and I, in our Food Wars book, called it the productionist system. That was put in place by policymakers in the 1930s. It was not just a happen chance. It was deliberate policy. And it was evidence-based in the time. It was right, because in the 1930s, in the 20s, and for the previous 70 years of nutrition and public health sciences, the evidence was about undernutrition. We needed to produce more. All the efforts, the great scientists of the 20s and 30s, the people who got Nobel Prizes in the food area, whether it was vitamins or agricultural production, were getting it for about raising production, producing more, because the assumption was the problem was not enough food. And now we have a problem of like the city, we're just south of the border of the City of London, one of the 3 finance capital centres of the world, just like they have a wall of cash actually sitting there. There's no shortage of money in the world. Now there is a wall of calories and food. There's no shortage. There's an oversupply problem, actually, and a maldistribution problem. So it's been a successful story, but it's actually been a transformation of the power relations. The third point is one of the things, I would say this, I'm a psychologist by training who's gone wrong 40 years ago. Okay, I've always, as Kevin knows and Steve knows, and some of you in this room know, and Barry knows, I'm someone who's interested in the mass psychology of food. I'm interested in food's messages, its social messages, its role in everyday life, its social glue element. It is impossible for me to walk into my local railway station in South London without walking past 34 offerings of food. 34. I counted them yesterday, again, just to check. It goes up. They go bust, because food businesses go bust more than any other businesses, quicker than any others. But there is just a wall of food trying to get down Tim Lang's throat. Okay. And it smells lovely, and it's gorgeous, and it's historically incredibly cheap. Okay. And that's a cultural problem. This cheapness, which was again one of the measures of success, the indicator for good agricultural economics from the 20s and 30s, make it more affordable, and a progress definition has actually now become part of our problem. And this consumerist model of food choice, that we will do the right thing for our bodies, has happened at the same time as the cultural rules have changed, not save and be sensible, and usually a mother controlling food distribution in the household, but now there's a ubiquity and no one controls you. You can do and eat as you like. The food, in a sense, is the apogee of the consumerist choice model, and that is actually very threatening politically. And fourth point, all of this big cultural transition, it's not just a nutrition transition, as Barry called it, it's also a supply transition, an entire systemic tradition, but also a cultural transition. And this has happened at a time when the public health world has weakened. I was asked to partly address what's going on, what can we do, and my very sober, if you want to read Jeff Rayner's and my most recent book, Ecological Public Health, we go into this at great length. There has been a weakening of public health. Actually, public health almost retired from the scene with food because its job was done. It had said, go away and try and produce. And in the 20s and 30s and 40s, the public health people started working with agriculture and said, let's build agriculture to meet public health goals. And then that generation died off, actually. I had the privilege to meet some of them before they died. They were fantastic. But they didn't get the fact that they'd created, for very unwitting reasons, this problem. And at that time, at the very moment when we needed a strengthening public health world, it's actually been weakened. But there are very interesting signs of that now changing. Barry is an example of it. May I salute him. Yesterday, here in Britain, 20 professors, I was one of them, so I declare an interest, basically declared war on the sugar, and said Britain has to reduce its sugar production and consumption by 30%. This is a land use issue. Now, Kevin and Steve, this is an issue I think we should discuss about the developing world. Cane production, maize production, the overproduction of fat is not just an issue of calories through fat, but calories through sugar. One of Barry's greatest paper with his colleagues was The Sweetening of the World's Diet. If you haven't read it, read it. So the weakening of public health, I think, is part of a difficulty, and we in public health have been moved on to a very narrow, soft policy levers terrain of information and labelling. These are the least effective mechanisms for cultural change. The least, the objective data suggests. Fifth point, this is politically sensitive. If you didn't know that, take it from me. There is big money involved here. There's big political stakes here. Very few politicians of left or right in European politics, I won't go into others, are willing to engage and confront the power of the food industry. This is deemed to be one of the success stories for very, very good reasons. I don't know. Andrew is at the end here. I know him well as well. I like him, believe it or not. Even though he comes from the food retail industry, he's shocked. His career's in ruins now. We've got on always... no, it wasn't. His career is fantastic. But the food industry is very powerful. And what we've actually got now is a very interesting situation. Andrew represents it, actually. I hope I'm not wrecking your career forever with this, saying there are splits, there are divergences in positions. There are some who want to deny the importance of obesity and overweight still. They are the bury their heads in the sands and really block it. But there are others who are saying, actually, you're right. We've got to have a different model of what the food industry does. I think we've got to help them out of their mess. But it's politically sensitive. Sixthly, and I'm almost there, what might change the situation? I summarise it. In fact, Andrew and I, you have had private discussions about this, so I'm not going to put this in your words. I think the situation in Britain, if we focus on Britain and Europe, Steve, the rich world, it's mess. It's drift and mess. I use those two words, drift and mess. There's no real clarity. The obesity time bomb became world news in the West from the beginning of the 2000s. We're 13 years on. And actually, not much has happened. And that I call a drift and mess situation. So let's accept it's that. Instead of saying something must be done, we need to say, why hasn't anything been done despite the strength of the evidence? We talk of evidence-based policy. The reality is blockages and despite it. So that's a critical issue we must analyse. This needs Kevin's brain and you at the ODI to tackle this. And how can the developing world address this in a way that's better than the failures of the developed world? Even though there are some breakthroughs, Barry referred to Bloomberg's billions being thrown at it, it's been fantastic. It's sort of white knight sort of politics, coming in from the edges, but it's not necessarily going to resolve it. One of the issues that's critical here is emerging is the issue of costs. Now, I'm going to be paradoxical. I don't know if Barry's still there. I've been looking at the data recently for what are the externalized costs of the current food system. They're quite high, actually, but they're not so high that it's imploding. There are some who argue that calling for taxes to re-internalize, I'm looking at Steve, this is a discussion with Steve, the economists say, well, let's tax it, let's re-internalize the costs. Well, Tim Marsh is here, it's about £10.5 billion from cardiovascular disease, external costs. That's sort of some, no, let's argue about it too much, but that's for Britain, that's on top of £180 billion spent on food. So it's huge sums, but relatively for the cost of food, it's not that big. And that's a problem. That's usually what gets politicians engaged, and they're not seeing it as so expensive as to have to sort something out. Maybe if we add up the environmental costs, the social costs, and the health costs, it'll get bigger, maybe 30 billion, 40 billion pounds. Well, that's going to be a bit of leverage, but we haven't got those collective studies yet, actually, let alone looked at them for the developing world. So I think there are some problems about getting arguments and data that may alter the situation. That's my point 6. And now my final point. I think the reality of obesity and overweight is that this is, and back to my first point, this is complex factors, complex drivers, complex inputs into shaping the food system. And that therefore requires complex levers. I don't see any simple intervention points. Even if one got a massive tax, say a fat tax, even if it was possible to do it. A sugar tax, possibly. I've always argued an advertising tax is probably simpler to do, actually. But you need all of those to have the multiple impact across the levels of what is driving this situation. That's the analysis that Jeff Rayner and I came up with, in fact, just up this road, for the chief scientist's foresight report on obesity here, that famous systems map that we helped develop, 50 or 60 of us there. The argument that Jeff and I made in our paper then in Obesity Reviews and repeated at great length in our book, Ecological Public Health, was we need to have, if we want to address this issue, we've got to have changes in the material world, the built world, to make it easier to take exercise, rather than to build the world around cars and non-renewable fossil energy, moving Tim Lang about. We need to make Tim Lang burn food, driving himself about on a bicycle. Well, that requires cities to be redesigned. That's a very big ask when you think what's happened in the last 100 years, let alone if you think the American way of existence. The second is we've got to alter the biological realities. I think climate change is our great aid here. Actually, climate change is now driving what the shape of the future diet of the world will be. The embedded water, the embedded carbon, the embedded destruction of biodiversity in food, in other words, ecosystems are coming up to alter the food system anyway. And this problem of obesity and overweight is linked to that. And the third and the fourth dimensions are the nature of food in our social relations, how we relate. I'm sufficiently ancient to have been related to by my mother through food, and that's what parents do, okay? But that used to be the model. You sat round a table and ate. Now you eat all the time, as well as sitting round a table and eating in the rich world. And that's why we have 1.4 billion people obese and overweight, alongside 0.9 of a billion hungry. It's this complex over, under, and malconsumption world that we've got to address. So to conclude, my argument, and it's an argument, is with all this data that Barry et al. And others have produced, and you have beautifully summarized in this report, again I salute ODI for this, is it requires multiple levers because it's a multiple dynamic. That's very difficult in policy terms. Politicians have slow and small attention spans. Getting all of what I've said in 10 minutes into something that they can do in an attention span of 1 minute is impossible, actually. And that's the problem. That is our collective problem. But the good news is outside pressure is building up. It will be, as ever, a big change that will happen with a combination of inside and outside pressure. That's what I think we're now poised to do.
Tim, before passing on to Andrew, I just want to ask one question specifically on the UK and rich world side. That, you know, one of the features that if you look at the data for obesity for the UK, it's there's a very steep socioeconomic gradient. So obesity levels, as I understand, are roughly twice as high among the poorest 20% as they are among the richest 20%. In the US, you have that, plus you have a very strong racial element to it. So, you know, poor Afro-Americans, poor Hispanics in particular. I mean, I just wonder, in terms of the politics of change, you know, how significant is that factor, that, you know, it's an issue which is borne with, you know, particularly by the poor?
I think it is a very significant one, because part of the problem, one of the reasons, forgive me if you thought, why was I talking about the consumerist model of food choice? It's because of that. Because that leads very quickly into saying, well, if it's you who's choosing to eat what you're eating, it's your fault if you're getting fat. It very quickly gets into this problem of blame. And in the States, we see this politics, as Kevin knows only too well, having lived there. We see this problem of black and ethnic minority groups being blamed essentially for cultural failings, for not cooking enough, or not looking after their children enough. This is the social dynamic, the moral, if one wants to use the old word, the moral dynamic behind obesity. So I think you're quite right to ask that question, Kevin. I don't think it's just a question, there's not just a social gradient of income, there is a generational one actually, and there is also an age group one as well. There are multiple dynamics to here, but the big point is that this is a population shift. This is the great Jeffrey Rose's arguments, epidemiological argument. There's no point just targeting the fat, because everyone is fat, or almost everyone is fat. We've got to say the gradation, the variations will from here to here. Actually, we've got to just aim to get the gradations to be over here.
Okay, sit back down. We don't want to lose you after you arrive
So late.
Okay,
Was that an
Andrew.
answer?
Thank you. That was a good answer.